Chaplain Capone was awarded our nation's highest and most prestigious award for valor by the President of the United States, the Medal of Honor, on 11 April 2013. This afternoon, he will formally be inducted into the Pentagon's most sacred place, the Hall of Heroes. Our hosts for today's ceremony are the Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of the Army, the Honorable John M. McHugh, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Raymond T. Odierno, and the Sergeant Major of the Army, Raymond F. Chandler III.
You guys ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the arrival of the official party and remain standing for the singing of our national anthem by Sergeant First Class Hinton and the invocation which will be delivered by Chaplain Donald Rutherford, Army Chief of Chaplains.
Stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Let us pray. Almighty God, today we enshrine into the Hall of Heroes, a man intimately connected to his God and fiercely loyal to his country. Under the most arduous of combat situations, Chaplain Emil Capaun's faith and indomitable spirit inspired the soldiers around him. Understanding that the easy way would not suffice and choosing to go beyond the call of duty, Chaplain Capaun's example still inspires us today. We give thanks for a humble chaplain, a man who was guided by the desire to do what was right, honorable, and self-sacrificial. Choosing to risk greatly in spite of the odds, Chaplain Kapaun's strength of spirit and commitment to his fellow soldiers teach us what it means to love greatly, to lay down one's life for his friends. His devotion to his troops, O God, the servant of God and of our nation, captured the best of what an Army chaplain strives to be. We are humbled to honor a soldier's chaplain. We are honored to call this strong and virtuous leader truly one of our own. May your blessings and his presence rest upon each of us this day. We ask this always in your holy name, and we pray, amen.
Amen. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, General Raymond T. Odierno.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today as we honor Chaplain Capone. He was a man of deep conviction and great piety, with an intrinsic love for his fellow man, the Army, and his country. Like Chaplain Kapaun, our Army chaplains experience and understand firsthand the unique challenges that soldiers and families may encounter in military service. The conflicts may change, but the comfort and compassion of Army chaplains remains constant, unyielding, and indiscriminate. Chaplain Kapaun is the 7th military chaplain to be awarded the Medal of Honor. It speaks volumes to the character of this extraordinary soldier, who is also awarded the Legion of Merit and the Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor. Though it is reported that Chaplain Kapaun never fired a single bullet, he saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives, physically, mentally, and spiritually. He possessed a striking humility, fearless courage, and unconditional love for the men who fought at his side. His unconquerable spirit earned him the trust and respect of every person he came in contact with, both on and off the battlefield. Frankly, he epitomized the essence of a soldier. The inherent trust and unspoken devotion to one another. All of you know war is very personal. It's about fighting for those on your right and on your left to achieve something greater than yourself. It is about embodying the moral and ethical values and having the physical courage necessary to accomplish the mission. I want to welcome all distinguished guests today: Secretary Hagel, Secretary McHugh, Senator Pat Roberts from Kansas, Congressman Pomeo, it's good to see you again, sir. General Retired Skip Sharp, the honorary 60th anniversary chairman of the Korean War commemoration. Lieutenant General Retired Bob Foley, former Medal of Honor recipient. First Lieutenant Retired Brian Thacker, former Medal of Honor recipient. Sergeant Major Brian Battagular, Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Sergeant Major of the Army Ray Chandler. Chaplain Kapaun had one brother, Eugene, who passed away in 2010. Unfortunately, Eugene's widow is unable to be here today, but I know she is here truly in spirit. Chaplain Kapaun's nephew Ray and Ray's wife Leanne Kapaun are here. Thank you so much for being here. You've meant so much to this whole ceremony and process. Angela Gerlach, his niece, Kenny Kapaun, his nephew, and David Kapaun, his nephew, are also here. We thank all of you for being here today. We're also honored to have Korean War veterans and former prisoners of war who served alongside Father Kapaun here today. And I'd like to recognize these prisoners of war. Gerald Cavanaro, Richard Caverly, Mike Dow, Robert McCreevy, Herbert Miller, Joe Ramirez, William Richardson, Paul Roach, and Robert Wood. Would you all please stand so we can recognize you, please? Chaplain Kapaun gave his first Mass in 1940 in the small farming town of Pilsen, Kansas. He immediately immersed himself in the care of souls, which marked his life of service to God and country. 10 years later, and 7,000 miles away on the other side of the world, Chaplain Kapaun spent All Saints' Day on November 1st, 1950, saying 4 Masses for the men of 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. Chaplain Kapaun was where he wanted to be. Within his own words, my boys. The soldiers of the 8th Cavalry Regiment had little reason to suspect the imminent onslaught by the Chinese forces who had surrounded the small village of Unsan. Late that afternoon, the People's Volunteer Army launched a surprise perimeter attack on the U.S. and Republic of Korea soldiers. After 36 hours of hand-to-hand fighting, the 800 men of 3rd Battalion were isolated against thousands of Chinese peasant soldiers. In the middle of the firefight, amidst the barrage of artillery, machine gun, bazooka, and small arms fire, was Chaplain Kapaun. All the men who served at his side attest that he cared for them as soldiers and as men, regardless of their religious faith or absence thereof. He huddled a group of men together and ministered to each according to their respective traditions, in many cases giving them their last rites, because he candidly told them, a lot of you guys aren't going to make it home. To each of them, he was father. He gave those men the hope and courage they needed to fight, reaffirming their will to live. There on the battlefield with mortar fire coming in and the enemy massing around him, he raced foxhole to foxhole, hearing confessions, treating the wounded, and saying prayers over the dying. Multiple times he had the chance to retreat to safety, but there was never a question in his mind where he belonged. As he insisted, my place is with the wounded. Chaplain Capone was able to convince a Chinese soldier to negotiate the safe surrender of the American forces, saving 40 wounded men. Then, in an act of ultimate defiance against his captors, Chaplain Capone calmly walked over to a Chinese soldier who had the muzzle of his weapon against the forehead of a wounded Sergeant First Class Herbert Miller, ready to take his life. Chaplain Capone casually pushed aside the executioner, who stood frozen in disbelief, picked up Sergeant First Class Miller, put him on his back, and walked away, both of them untouched. Such was the power of the unspoken influence and leadership that Chaplain Capone had. Even though he wore the cross of the Corps chaplain's insignia on his collar, and not the crossed rifles of the infantry, he was a hero of the Battle of Unsan and the many days that followed. 8th Cavalry Regiment lost over 600 soldiers in the battle. It is perhaps no coincidence that November 2nd fell on the Catholic holiday of All Souls Day. On that day, and for the next 19 months until his death, Chaplain Capone and his comrades were held as prisoners of war by the Chinese. Through months of starvation, abuse, and torture, sickness and death, his spirit, his faith, and his dry sense of humor never faltered. In fact, in a conversation with a fellow POW, Bob Wood, he revealed that this was in fact his second time in the Army and his second war, because Chaplain Capone had served in World War II in the China-Burma-India campaign. After 2 years in the Army, he went home to Kansas, but re-enlisted again in 1948. Bob Wood was shocked and asked him, why would you ever decide to rejoin the Army a second time? And Chaplain Capone, who was emaciated and bruised, his body ravaged by dysentery, pneumonia, and a blood clot, said without pause, well, my God, Bob, did you ever have to deal with one of those women's church groups? The true story here is Chaplain Capone ministered until the end, giving the last rites to a dying prisoner, writing the Our Father and Hail Mary on a scrap of paper, which he gave to another prisoner, and in his final hour, hearing the confession of yet another fellow prisoner. His fellow soldiers, for whom he gave his last dying breath, meant more to him than life. His actions reflect extraordinary courage, uncommon value, and the ethos of millions of soldiers and our chaplains today. His legacy will live on forever in our hearts, but most importantly in our souls, for what he truly believed in. He believed in man. He believed in those who stood side by side with him. That's what was most important thing for him. And that will live on for generations. The strength of our army, the strength of our nation is our army. The strength of our army is our soldiers. The strength of our soldiers is our families. And that's what makes us Army strong. Thank you very much for being here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable John M. McHugh.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I won't repeat all the welcomes that the chief said, but I do want to, of course, recognize Secretary Hagel. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for leading the sponsorship of this great event and also taking time out of your enormously busy schedule to join us. To members of the DoD family, the Army family, civilian as well as uniform, thank you not just for joining us, but for the great sacrifices that you put forward in behalf of the military of this great nation. Special thanks to my former colleague, Pat Roberts, Congressman Pompeo. Welcome, gentlemen. Just remember our gracious hospitality in our next hearing. Please. To the Kapaun family, Ray and Lee, and so many others, cousins, nephews, thank you, not just for helping to bring this story to us, but for letting us share in what I hope you're beginning to understand is such a special opportunity for us. And I had a chance to spend some time with Chaplain's friends, his colleagues, his battle buddies, his spiritual buddies from the Korean theater at lunch, and incredible men, and we are so thrilled that they are here today helping us see the true story of a great American and a great American patriot. Today we, as the chief said, truly are gathering to honor a remarkable soldier, a man of unquestioned and uncommon courage, and a man of truly unbridled faith, Army Chaplain Captain Emil Capone. Father Capone's name and exploits will be from this day forward forever enshrined in this Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, a recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military award. And it probably goes without saying he joins in a very elite company of American heroes, two of whom are with us here today, who we deeply appreciate, who put self below service, who displayed acts of personal valor that truly were above and beyond the call of duty. But as elite as that small band, that small company is amongst the recipients of the Medal of Honor, Father Capone's story is in itself wholly unique, wholly different. He didn't charge a pillbox. He didn't defeat an enemy battalion or brigade or division by himself. Rather, Father Capone's only weapons were his steely defiance that inspired his fellow prisoners of war, the words he spoke which brought comfort to the soldiers with whom he served, and a simple piece of purple ribbon that he wore around his neck, a mark of his chaplaincy, his priesthood. But don't make any mistake about it, Father Capone was a soldier, and a soldier in the purest and the truest sense of the word. He was a man who volunteered for service in Korea, even as the chief recognized he had already served his country in the Chaplain Corps during World War II. During the Korean War, the good and brave father moved fearlessly under enemy fire to bring aid and comfort to the wounded and to the dying. And after being captured, he continued to lead. He continued to serve, securing food for starving POWs, and in so doing, feeding not just their bodies, but their souls and their spirits. Reading Father Kapaun's story, I can't help but think he was part Audie Murphy and part Father Flanagan. In his memoir, Murphy, who was also a Medal of Honor recipient, wrote that when a chaplain visited a company and he prayed for what he described the strength of our arms and for the souls of the men, we don't consider our denominations. Helmets come off. Catholics, Jews, and Protestants bow their heads and finger their weapons. It is, Murphy said, frontline religion. So it was in that Korean prison camp where Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, even those who declared no particular faith, drew courage, and they drew strength, and they drew hope from a priest whom one survivor once called the best foot soldier he had ever known. To be sure, Father Capone was a man of contradictions. A man of faith, he was at the same time blunt. It is said he often cursed. A servant of God, he nevertheless stole food from his captors, and that was an act that troubled him. Something he found at odds with his faith, even though because of it, unquestionably, many prisoners' lives were saved. Father Capone rectified this contradiction by praying to St. Dismas, the thief who it is taught was crucified at the right hand of Jesus Christ. There's no question he was a resourceful man, and that's a trait he may well have perfected in his earlier life. There's a story told that when the good father was just about 7 years old, and not yet the good father, it was determined that he was old enough to milk the family cow. Now, where I and Herb Miller come from in upstate New York, there are more cows than people. Senator Roberts can talk about cows, being from Kansas. And getting to milk that family cow, I can tell you that's a pretty big deal. Of course, it was important to the family for another reason. It would free up Emil's mom to work more often in the fields with his dad. But that couldn't just happen before his mom could really hand over the reins, or I guess hand over the udders in this case. She needed to train Emil on the proper way to milk the cow, and the training from mom to son, by all accounts, went very, very well. And finally, the mom felt confident enough to hand over responsibility for milking that cow to that 7-year-old young man. And on the first day, without his mother's supervision, Emil led the cow to the fence post, tied the cow up, just as mom had taught him. But that cow refused to be milked. Every time and at every angle that little Emil tried to approach the cow would just step away. Now, Emil stood there for a moment. He stared at the cow, as 7-year-olds are prone to do, trying to figure out how to make it all work, and then it hit him. Problem was the cow wasn't used to seeing him. It was used to seeing his mom, so he had an answer. Went in the house, put on one of his mom's dresses, came out, milked the cow. Problem solved. Resourcefulness, even at such a young age. Much later, as we all know now, Father Capone was entered into the process for sainthood in the Catholic Church, where he has been declared a servant of God. And the stories that led to that moment are captivating, and I'd like to just briefly share a few with you. In one story, a 12-year-old's kidneys had shut down as an autoimmune disorder had ravaged her body. Her family prayed for a miracle. The family prayed to Father Capone. At one point, her lungs were so damaged that doctors said that even if she survived, she'd be on oxygen for the rest of her life. 6 months later, after leaving the hospital, she was playing competitive soccer. No medical explanation available. In another account, a young runner collapsed during a 5-kilometer charity race. His arms and legs convulsing, and soon after he lay there without a pulse and without a heartbeat. As the young man's uncle, a physician, was there and tried to feverishly revive him, the young man's 14-year-old cousin prayed to Father Capone. Through a combination of fate, coincidence, many believe through a divine intervention, that young runner, nearly presumed dead, is with us today, Nick De La Sega. And is Nick in the audience? Nick, he was at lunch. I wasn't sure you made it. And there's one more. And yet another remarkable story. A young pole vaulter crushed his skull in an accident during his sport, and he too was nearly written off for dead. Not long after his family began praying to Father Capone, the boy awoke, and in doing so mystified doctors. Soon after that, he began talking, and after less than a month in a hospital, he went home wearing a T-shirt bearing the words "Miracle Man." And the Miracle Man, Chase Keir, is also with us here today. Chase, stand up. You may not have recognized it at the time, you may not recognize it now, but you have a very important role in this story. Thanks for being there. The Wichita Eagle carried these and other stories about Father Capone's life. And in the story of the young girl, the newspaper noted that a Vatican official came to check out the facts. He met with that young lady's doctors and through an interpreter said it was a good thing that such good Catholic doctors came forward to tell her story. Now he was told the doctors weren't Catholic, they were Protestant. Vatican official, according to the story, seemed stunned. Even the Protestants, he thought, thinks it's a miracle. Regardless of one's faith, regardless of one's beliefs, we know that Father Capone was a remarkable man and a man who continues to inspire us all. During a Palm Sunday sermon in 1941, when Father Capone was only 25 years old, he said that, and I quote, "A great leader exerts a most powerful influence over the hearts and minds of his followers," end quote. From a Korean prison camp to a Wichita hospital room to the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, Chaplain Emil Capone remains to this day a powerful influence whose courage, whose valor and selfless sacrifice continue to exert a powerful influence over each and every one of us. And we are grateful, we are humbled at long last to honor him today. Thank you all, and God bless America.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Chuck Hagel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a prepared speech, but in the interest of each of you, I shall not deliver it. I want to instead just express a couple of thoughts, because I think, before I welcome all of you on behalf of the Department of Defense, in particular the Capone family, Secretary McHugh and General Odierno, in rather moving but human terms, have expressed, I think, so much of what Chaplain Capone was about, his life, and who he really was, aside from his valiant efforts on behalf of others. In a day when heroes, real heroes, are hard to find, at a time when America is searching for a center of gravity to believe in its leaders, believe once again in its institutions, it's particularly important that we grab a hold of people like Father Capone and not just acknowledge those acts of heroism and those great, astounding acts of gallantry and what he did as a clergyman and a man of the cloth, but the composite, who he was, what he was about. It was not just mortal courage. It was really more about moral conviction. It was about integrity. Character and courage are the two indispensable elements of a person's life. I think all of us attempt to live up to that. We all fail, but we get back up and continue to try to achieve those responsible human characteristics that society expects from each of us, and especially the next generation. And the acts that were recited today, performed by Father Capone, are, yes, tremendous acts by any measurement and by any metric applied. But it is the whole of the man, where he came from, how he was shaped, how he was raised, what he believed in. He just didn't appear in World War II. He didn't just appear in the Korean War. Something shaped him. How did that happen? I suspect he was born with many of those traits, but those traits don't necessarily materialize or develop into something as an end product. The stories that Secretary McHugh and General Odierno shared with us are part of that journey that was unfortunately cut short. But it tells us a lot about our country. It tells us a lot about who we are. And that's what I've always thought is so critical to remember in great, great men like Father Capone. As a very young kid growing up in a little town in western Nebraska at the time of the Korean War, I recall vividly, 5 years old, how my mother and my grandmother and grandfather drove my father to the Greyhound bus depot in Ainsworth, Nebraska, and put my father on the bus to Omaha, Nebraska, because my father was a World War II veteran, like many in this audience, and was being called up for active duty in Korea. Not dissimilar to Father Capone's story. And I remember that vividly, even though I was 5 years old. Now, my father didn't have to go to Korea, but went back into training, as many did, to prepare our forces for another war. And that whole time in my life that I recall, the same thing that was happening in Pilsen, Kansas, and happening all over America, shaped all of us. And as especially our Korean War veterans, who I particularly salute today, and particularly noted, and we salute again the POWs, former POWs who are here. That war was, and still is, often referred to in history as a forgotten war. What was it about? It was kind of this blip. What was it really? Well, those who served, those who fought and died, and those who endured brutal circumstances in a POW camp can tell you that, what it was about. And the human dynamic of that, as I think is so well understood, in particular at the Korean War Memorial. And I suspect almost everyone in this room has visited that at least once. Because it reflects on a time, a defining time in our history, in the world. It reflects once again on a defining time in our society. We shaped a generation and another generation of Americans as a result of that war and those sacrifices and leadership that were displayed. And I know of no finer example to point to for us to come together to recognize, to honor, to remember, and to build our lives around than the recognition that we give to Father Capone today here at the Department of Defense by formally installing him into the Hall of Heroes, as he was acknowledged and represented a couple of days ago in the Oval Office in the White House by President Obama. And to the Capone family, thank you for being here. I know how proud you are and how justifiably proud you are for what Father Capone represents and will continue to represent. So to each of you who served our country, whether it was in the Korean War or whatever capacity, those who continue to serve this country, many seated here today, our country thanks you. We appreciate you, and we are honored by you. And this honor is reflected on all of you by the recognition of Father Capone today. Thank you very much.
Secretary McHugh, General Odierno, Sergeant Major of the Army Chandler, and Mr. Ray Capone will now join Secretary Hagel on stage for the induction ceremony. The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, March 3, 1863, has awarded in the name of Congress the Medal of Honor to Chaplain Captain Emil J. Kapaun, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Chaplain Emil J. Capone distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division during combat operations against an armed enemy at Unsan, Korea, from November 1st to the 2nd, 1950. On November 1st, as Chinese Communist forces viciously attacked friendly elements, Chaplain Capone calmly walked through withering enemy fire in order to provide comfort and medical aid to his comrades and rescue friendly wounded from no man's land. Though the Americans successfully repelled the assault, they found themselves surrounded by the enemy. Facing annihilation, the able-bodied men were ordered to evacuate. However, Chaplain Capone, fully aware of his certain capture, elected to stay behind with the wounded. After the enemy succeeded in breaking through the defense in the early morning hours of November 2nd, Chaplain Capone continually made rounds as hand-to-hand combat ensued. As Chinese Communist forces approached the American position, Chaplain Capone noticed an injured Chinese officer amongst the wounded and convinced him to negotiate the safe surrender of the American forces. Shortly after his capture, Chaplain Capone, with complete disregard for his personal safety and unwavering resolve, bravely pushed aside an enemy soldier preparing to execute Sergeant First Class Herbert A. Miller. Not only did Chaplain Capone's gallantry save the life of Sergeant Miller, but also his unparalleled courage and leadership inspired all those present, including those who might have otherwise fled in panic, to remain and fight the enemy until captured. Chaplain Capone's extraordinary heroism and selflessness, above and beyond the call of duty, are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, and the United States Army. The Hall of Heroes plaque will now be unveiled, inducting Chaplain Emil J. Kapaun into the Hall of Heroes. At this time, the Secretary of Defense will present the Medal of Honor flag. On 23 October 2002, Public Law 107-248, Section 8143, established the Medal of Honor flag to recognize service members who have distinguished themselves by gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor flag commemorates the sacrifice and blood shed for our freedoms and gives emphasis to the Medal of Honor being the highest award for valor by an individual serving in the armed forces of the United States. The light blue color with gold fringe bearing 13 white stars are adapted from the Medal of Honor ribbon. Thank you, Secretary Hagel, Secretary McHugh, General Odierno, and Sergeant Major Chandler. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ray Capone.
Secretary and Mrs. Hagel, Secretary McHugh, General and Mrs. Odierno, Sergeant Major Chandler, Senator Roberts. Medal of Hall recipients, Lieutenant General Retired Foley and Mr. Thatcher. General and flag officers, distinguished Department of Defense staff, my family, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Wow. I want to start off today with getting this issue with our last name straightened out. If you talk to my grandparents, if you talk to my mom and dad, if you talk to Father Emil, and if you talk to the POWs that are with them, our last name is pronounced Kapaun. If you talk to people in Kansas, our last name is pronounced Capone. And you're probably wondering how that happened. The story that I heard was that when they were dedicating the high school in Wichita, Kansas, that was named after Father Emil, a cardinal had came in to do the dedication, and when he was doing the dedication, he ended up saying Capone Memorial High School. Well, who's going to push against a cardinal? It stuck. But either way, Kapaun or Capone, it really doesn't matter. The only thing I ask is please do not call us late for dinner, please. I'm not really sure how I became the elected person to be the one of my family to come up and accept this honor, of what this great honor is and what this great honor means to me, means to the Pilsen community, means to what my dad had always hoped for. I think there was a time when my family got together and they all started talking, without me of course, and they said, you know, Ray likes to talk a lot and we can never get him to shut up, so let's just let him do it. The Korean War was touted as a forgotten war, the 3-year blip in the historical radar, but to the brave men sitting here today who endured with him famine, fear, and communist prison of war camp for those 3 years, I'm sure it has never been forgotten. though maybe they would wish it could be. I think they will also agree that the spiritual resilience and leadership demonstrated by Father Emil in that camp is also unforgettable. They proved that by returning from their ordeal to write articles, books, and letters in order to tell the story of the soldier, the saint, Chaplain Emil Capone, my uncle. Father Emil was a big brother to my dad. He loved him dearly, and Dad always knew this day would come. And one of the things that we talked about as far as being a legacy and being in the shadow of a legacy is what it was like to have the Capone name. Sometimes that was the greatest honor in the world, and I would say 99% of the times that was the greatest honor in the world. But there were times Mom always made sure that we were the last ones to leave church. We had to make sure that we never left church before everybody else. And as a 10-year-old boy, I can tell you, sometimes that legacy was kind of a pain to me. And there always seemed to be this little sweet old lady sitting on the other side of the church that she was bound and determined that she was going to beat the Kapaun family. She was going to be the last one out of Mass. I'm here to say today that sweet little old lady never won that battle. But on the sad side of things, my dad is not here to witness this today. As said earlier, he died in 2010, a mere 3 years ago. Again, that 3-year reminder, a reminder that is awful hard to forget. My grandmother knew that Father Emil, what his destiny was and where he was going to end up. Even as a small boy, even as at 4 years old, she would watch him stack cardboard boxes in their living room and put an old towel on top of it and say the prayers and try to say what he could say, even in the Latin words, whether he understand what he was saying or not. So she knew from a very early age that he was going to be a saint and never had any doubt in that whatsoever. I never knew my uncle. I never met him personally. He died tragically in that prisoner of war camp some 60 years ago. But the resilient and amazing prisoners of war who knew him would never let him die in our hearts. And the great town of Pilsen, Kansas would never let his name die as well. They always made sure through every generation to come that they always knew who Father Emil was, and they would never let that name die. But it was the men of that camp, the men that told the world about my uncle, nurturing the living, caring for the wounded, and honored the fallen every day. They talked of how he could make a lukewarm cup of stagnant water seem like a cup of steaming hot coffee, and how without saying a single word, he would convince the exhausted and defeated men to pick up a wounded man on a stretcher and carry them safely to battle, even at their own risk of life. If not for these men, I may not have known such a lifelong personal relationship with my uncle. I thank them dearly, and I honor them today for having the strength to survive, to come home and tell the story of the soldier, the spiritual leader, the saint, Chaplain Emil Capone. And on a personal note, I've had these last 2 days to spend with them that I have not had before. I've been able to talk with them, I've been able to laugh with them, and I've been able to cry with them. I've been able to see my uncle in them, which I've never been able to do. And these men are the bravest men that I can say I know today that are living here today. And I would really love for everybody to give them a huge hand of appreciation one more time. While Father Emil's legacy is Capone or legacy, it's really a story about the power of one man to change the world if not everyone in it, at least the world of those who have heard it. So it is the presence of great men who served with my uncle that this day that I promise to continue to tell the story of Father Emil and their stories and the stories of the 37,000 men and women who died during the Korean War and the stories who did come home with the people. I know Father Emil, if he was standing up here today, I know he'd look back in these last 2 days and he would say, "Oh, shucks, you kidding me? You guys did all of this for me. All I was really doing was my job. All I was doing is what I needed to do. All I was doing is what God directed me to do." There were a lot braver men than what I am. But he would also look out at his POW buddies. And I know he would walk over to you guys today, and he would wrap his arms around you, and he would say, "I'm so happy you guys made it home. And please, please don't be sad for me, because I made it home too." Thank you for sharing this special day with my family. May God continue to bless America, our military, our veterans, and their family. God bless. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kapaun. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and join in the singing of the Army Song. The words to the Army Song can be found in your program.
First to fight for the right and to build the nation's might, and the army goes rolling along. Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won, and the army goes rolling along. Then it's hi, hi, hey, the army's on its way. Count off the cadence loud and strong, for wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Ladies and gentlemen, please pause for a moment at your seats to allow the official party to exit the auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, please continue to remain at your seats until your row has been released. We invite the Capone family and friends to enjoy the reception in the hallway just outside the auditorium. This concludes today's ceremony.